Is it time to let Russ cook again? Welcome into this edition of Seattle Seahawks Today, powered by Chat Sports. Tyler Jones, your fearless leader, here with you. Thanks for joining us. Coming up on today's show, we will examine the possibility of a return to Seattle for Russell Wilson after his release from the Denver Broncos that was announced yesterday. We'll go over this and show you some numbers and how realistic it is and what the plan is at the quarterback position for the Seattle Seahawks going forward, coming up in just a matter of moments. Before we do, folks, we are on the verge of hitting 50.5 thousand subscribers here on Seahawks Today, just over 75 away from reaching that next milestone. For the latest happenings on your favorite team all off season long, this is the place to be. We're certainly going to ramp things up with free agency starting next week. We're talking trades, draft, and more. Your off-season headquarters is right here on Seattle Seahawks Today. Subscribe now for free, youtube.com/SeahawksTV, and we'll get started with today's show. Now, let me just say this right off the top. Let's set the tone early here when it comes to the idea of Russ in Seattle. I sure hope the Seahawks do not do this. Let me be very frank from the jump here, that I am very adamantly opposed to the idea of bringing Russell Wilson back to Seattle. But I don't think that it's impossible that this could happen. There's a greater than zero chance that the Seahawks could go this route. Let me explain what we mean by this. The Broncos cutting Russell Wilson is expected to be a post-June 1 transaction, so he could sign with any team next week, but it's not going to be official and under the NFL's money system of sorts till June 1, right? And the Broncos are looking at cap charges of most likely splitting up the $80 million essentially here between 2 years of what's going to count against the cap with a hard cap hit. $35.4 million this year, $49.6 million next year. And so then what does that mean for the next team he plays for? Well, in theory, he could play for the vet minimum for his next team while forcing Denver to pay all that money. So essentially, if it's Seattle or any other team for that matter, they could bring in Russell Wilson and force the Broncos to pay him all of that guaranteed money and play for the league minimum. So essentially, a team could get Russ for free, essentially. It's a pretty good situation, much better than what the Denver Broncos are dealing with, right? The resume for Russell Wilson, we all know, is as good as it gets, right? But it doesn't tell the full story. A 9-time Pro Bowler, Super Bowl champion, Walter Payton Man of the Year, had a really good run with Seattle. The last 2 years in Denver, the first year with Nathaniel Hackett as his head coach was pretty rough. Last year, bounced back, and I thought was actually pretty solid. I think Denver, if I'm going to be frank, is stupid for doing what they're doing here of letting Russ walk and still having to pay him here. Last year, he wasn't bad. He had a nice bounce-back season, 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, over 3,000 passing yards. His completion percentage was up 66.4%. And on the Seahawks end of things, remember, Seattle's been very coy when it comes to Geno Smith, because then the next question becomes, all right, if you bring in Russ, what does that mean for Geno? And the Seahawks, they've told us, hey, Geno's our guy and all this, but not like with a resounding endorsement, right? And think about this too, okay? Pete Carroll is gone now, right? And that's twofold. One, Geno Smith was Pete Carroll's guy, and two, the big issues with Russell Wilson in Seattle were mostly with Pete Carroll and that coaching staff. So maybe they say time heals all wounds here. If you're going to bring him back, now might be the opportunity to do so. Now, John Schneider said this last week about Geno Smith, said he's the starter until he's not. We have a vision, we have a plan for what we'll be doing at the quarterback position. So could there be a world where Russ comes back and Geno are under the same roof? We know they've told Geno that he's coming back next year, but does that mean with Russ around? Let's ask you guys, our pinned comment today, should the Seahawks sign Russell Wilson or not? Y for yes, And for no, weigh in the comments section. Tell us what you think, if they should sign Russ or not. Now, knowing what we know personally, I rather roll with Geno than bring Russ back in the circus that comes with Russ. Remember, with Russell Wilson, it's not just the football player you're getting, but you're talking about the other sideshow stuff. We heard about in Denver with, wanting his office there and his QB coach and the ego that comes with it and everything that went on behind the scenes too. I don't get that with Geno Smith. I don't get the sideshow and all those shenanigans. I just get a football player with Geno Smith. You look at the numbers last year. Ross had a better year than Geno did, but not significantly better here. Geno was better than him in 2022 by a lot. So with all that to be said here, I'm not going to kick Geno to the curb when I'm not going to get a whole lot more out of Russell Wilson potentially. You look back on that trade and how this all worked out. Here we are 2 years later, and what the Seahawks got to bring in to get that deal done of Drew Lock, Noah Fant. Obviously, Shelby Harris is gone now. But Charles Cross, Boye Mafe, Tyreek Smith, he ultimately ended up getting cut. But Devin Witherspoon, Derek Hall, I mean, that trade situation worked out as well as it possibly could have for the Seattle Seahawks when they moved on from Russell Wilson and got what they got. And now the future's bright in Seattle, and you're trying to figure out your next step at the quarterback position. For me, what I'm looking at, the answer long-term is not Russell Wilson. It's not even Geno Smith, actually. At 35 years old, which is what Russell Wilson is, like Geno Smith, he isn't the long-term answer for the Seattle Seahawks. Russell Wilson realistically is hoping to get 5 more years at a top level, which with his lack thereof of arm strength and injury history, that seems very overly optimistic that he has 5 more years left in him. If I'm the Seattle Seahawks, the next quarterback beyond Geno Smith is a young franchise quarterback. That's what you should be looking towards. As we try to find the next direction of where Seattle's going to go at the quarterback position, long term, it's not Geno, it's not Russell Wilson. You need a young franchise quarterback, and we'll show you some options here in just a moment. Now, if you had to pick, though, which quarterback would you rather roll with next year? Russ or Geno Smith? If it's Russ, type R for Russell Wilson. If it's Geno, type G for Geno Smith. Let us know in the comment section which quarterback you'd rather have. The Seahawks pick at 16th overall, and you're not likely to get one of those blue chip quarterbacks, right? It seems highly unlikely that we're going to see Caleb Williams or Drake May or Jaden Daniels fall to where the Seahawks are at 16. They would likely have to trade up if they want one of those guys. But there's still some other potential options, including J.J. McCarthy out of Michigan, who had a very good weekend this past week, and his stock is rising, and heard Louis Riddick say a couple days ago that he expects J.J. McCarthy to potentially go top 10 now. Bo Nix out of Oregon, the nation's most accurate passer in college football last year. His stock kind of all over the place, but he is coming off a strong season with the Oregon Ducks. I still question about what we saw from him at Auburn. I still think deep down he's the same quarterback he was back then, that he took advantage of playing lesser competition in the Pac-12 with the Oregon Ducks. And then there's Michael Penix Jr., who also had a fantastic combine this past week, and somebody that Seattle fans are very familiar with, obviously played for the Washington Huskies. And with him, what's interesting, too, is he has spoken out and said that he would be more than willing to sit behind Geno and learn from Geno. We know about him quoting Geno Smith a while back, saying the infamous line, "They wrote me off, but I didn't write back." He's more than open to learning from. And that could be the perfect transition of what we've talked about, of the potential QB plan for the Seahawks here. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But who's a quarterback the Seahawks should draft? Let us know in the comments section. We've given you a couple names here. Weigh in. Let us know what you think. For me, when it comes to the future of what this Seahawks team should do going forward, Geno starts next season. You find your quarterback of the future, whether it's in this year's draft or whether it's in next year's draft. That quarterback of the future sits behind Geno Smith. And then we find our guy from there. That's the plan, I think, the best plan for success for the Seahawks team. We've seen this plan done, tried and true, time and time again, and it never seems to fail, whether it was Mahomes behind Alex Smith, whether it was Brock Purdy behind Jimmy Garoppolo, Lamar Jackson behind Joe Flacco, Aaron Rodgers behind Brett Favre. This strategy works, and that's what I expect to see. That's the best plan of action going forward for the Seahawks. It's not Russ. It's not Geno long-term. Go get your young quarterback. Let them sit behind Geno and go from there. Subscribe now to Seahawks Today, and we'll see you next time here on the channel.